Section 2.3.19. Stocks may be categorized by industry. The accompanying data represent 3-year rates of return for a sample of financial stocks and retail stocks, and we're completing parts A through E below. So here's our financial stocks and here's our retail stocks. And part A, what they want us to do is they want us to construct a relative frequency distribution for each industry. So to make an easy comparison, we're going to create each frequency distribution so that the lower class limit of the first class is -20 and the class width is 20. So in the first class going from -20 to -0.01, we see that up here there is one value that's in between there, so therefore we have 1. Okay, and then we would continue to move on to find out what that frequency is. So between 0 and 19.99 we have 5, and so on. So therefore we create our frequencies for the financial stocks and do the same thing for the retail stocks. We have our classes and then we're going to put down our frequency for each one. Now what we want to do is we're creating a frequency distribution. So we're looking for the percentage of the frequency over the sum of the total frequency. So the amount of the total sum of the frequency for the financial stocks is 35. In addition, it's the same thing with the retail stocks, which is the sum of the 35. So in order for us to figure out what is that relative frequency, or for the class of -20 to -0.01, we have 1. So 1 over 35 is approximately 0.029, and then we would do the same for the rest to get that. Same thing over here. If we take the value of 3 for -20 to -0.01 and divide that by 35, then we get 0.086. And therefore we now have created and constructed a relative frequency distribution for part A. Okay, so now we're going to draw a relative frequency histogram for each industry. So we're going to use the relative frequency distributions for part A to create histograms. So in this case here, we're going to use StatCrunch to be able to do that. So we're going to open up our data into StatCrunch. And so we're going to go ahead and then graph a histogram. We're going to start with the financial stocks. Now we want a relative frequency, so we're going to select relative frequency. We're going to start at -20, and then we have a width at 20 according to our directions. And then from here, we're going to select compute. And therefore, there is our relative frequency histogram for the financial stocks. Okay, next, we're then going to graph the histogram, the relative frequency histogram for retail stocks. So again, make sure you select relative frequency. We're starting at -20. Our class width is 20. And then we're going to go ahead and select compute. And then therefore, there is our relative frequency histogram for retail stocks. So now we can see how we can compare both of them. So now we've drawn the relative frequency histograms for each industry. So now what we want to do is we want to construct a relative frequency polygon for each of the two industries. A relative frequency polygon is a graph that uses points connected by line segments to represent the relative frequencies for the classes. It is constructed by plotting a point above each class midpoint on a horizontal axis at a height equal to the relative frequency of the class. Next, the line segments are drawn connecting consecutive points, and then 2 additional line segments are drawn connecting each end of the graph with the horizontal axis. Now before we come back up here, we need to look at how we need to graph this. So when we graph this in StatCrunch, we have to enter class midpoints in the column variable 1 and the frequency or relative frequency in variable 2, and then title the columns. Now we're going to enter a class midpoint one class below the first class midpoint with a frequency or relative frequency of 0. Also, we're going to enter a class midpoint one class above the last class midpoint with a frequency or relative frequency of 0. So let me show you what I mean by that. Okay, so here is our first class going from negative 20 to negative 0.01. We need to put in a class before that and apply a 0 as a frequency. So since we know our class width is 20, we're going to subtract 20 from negative 20, which makes this negative 40, and this goes to negative 19.99, which gives us 0.00. And then also at the end of this, we're going to add 20, which is 200, going to 219.99, and therefore we're going to add a 0.000 for a relative frequency. And then we would do the same thing with the other stocks. So here we have negative 40 to negative 19.999, okay, and then we have 0.000, and then over here we're adding 20 to 220 to give us 240, 259.99, which gives us 0.0000. Okay, now next, in our variable 1 column, we need to put midpoints in there. In order to find a midpoint, what we want to do is we need to take the upper and the lower limits, add them together, and divide it by 2. So we're just going to pick the third class. We're going to add 0 plus 19.99 and divide it by 2. When we divide that by 2, we get 9.995, which is approximately 10. So since 10 is the midpoint for the third class, that means here in the third row, we're going to put 10 in for the midpoint. Okay, and then since we know that the class width is 20, when we add 20 to 10, we're going to get 30. And when we add 20 to 30, we're going to get 50. Now, if we take 10 and then subtract 20, we're going to get negative 10. And when we subtract 20 from negative 10, we're going to get negative 30. So now we need to put in the relative frequency for negative 30. Well, the relative frequency for negative 30 is the midpoint for the first class, which we had to write, which is 0.000. And the relative frequency for the midpoint negative 10 is 0.029. And the midpoint for 10 is the class of 0 and 19.99, which is 0.143. And then for 30, it's 0.114. And then for 50, it is 0.343. Okay, so now what we've done is we've then generated our midpoints for our column 1 here, and then our relative frequency for the financial stocks. And then over here, we have our retail stocks. We put in our midpoints that we have, which are similar here. We just extend it a little bit further because we have more classes. And then we have our column for relative frequency. And then recall here that we have a 0 at the beginning and a 0 at the end, which means that we're going one below and one above as far as our classes are concerned. Now, if we want to then generate a relative frequency polygon, in order to graph this, now we're going to have to manually put this into our StatCrunch table. Okay, so maybe what we can do is, and we want to get in the habit of knowing how to use StatCrunch, so we're going to put in F to stand for financial, and then we're going to call that midpoints. Okay, and then we're going to call this as the financial relative frequency. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and put in the midpoints. So we have negative 30, negative 10, 10, 30. And then we're going to apply the frequency 0.00, 0.029, 0.143, 0.114. And then we'll continue to go ahead and add that. So now that the midpoints are now all entered, and the relative frequency that we entered for the financial stocks, we're going to go ahead now and graph this. Now when we graph this, we want to go to scatter plot. Now when we go to scatter plot, we're going to then choose our X to be our midpoints, because that's the first column here. And then the Y variable is going to be the financial stocks relative frequency. So we're going to go ahead and select that. And so then we're going to go ahead and make sure we highlight our points and our lines. And then we're going to go ahead and compute. And so therefore, there's going to be our first relative frequency polygon according to our financial stocks. So let me go ahead and put that here. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and do the same thing with the retail stocks. So let's go back to our data set. Okay, and then what we can do is we're going to create now another column. We're going to call that R midpoints. And then we're going to call it R relative frequency. Okay, now just like you do with anything else, you can copy and paste these numbers in there, which are the midpoints, because they are the same. And then you can enter in the rest after the 210 because we have an extra 230 and then we have a 250 here. And then we're going to put in the relative frequency amounts corresponding to our chart there. So we have 0.00, 0.086, 0.057, and then we'll continue to complete that. So now all these values have now been entered for the retail stocks, for the retail, the midpoint, and relative frequency. So we're going to go ahead and graph, doing the same thing we did before. So we're going to go down graph and then select scatter plot. Our X variable is now going to be our R midpoints. And our Y variable is going to be our R relative frequency. And then we want to make sure that we display our points and our lines. And then we're going to go ahead and select compute. And now we have our relative frequency polygon for our retail stocks. For part D, we want to construct a relative frequency ogive for each of the two industries. Now, a relative frequency ogive is constructed by plotting points whose x coordinates are the upper class limits and whose y coordinates are the cumulative relative frequencies. So before we do that, let's go back to the instructions of being able to plot on StatCrunch ogives. We have to enter upper class limits in variable 1 and cumulative frequency in variable 2. And be sure to enter the upper class limit of the class that would precede the first class along with the cumulative frequency or cumulative relative frequency of 0. So coming back up here, the preceding class is -40 to -19.99. And we can see that we have our frequency of 0.000. Okay, so in our first column here, we're then going to write our upper class limits. So our upper class limit for the first one is -19.99. And then our cumulative frequency, we're starting at 0.000. Then our next upper class limit is -0.01. And then we're adding 0.029 for our cumulative frequency to the 0.00. So we get 0.029. And then the upper class limit of 19.99 has a frequency of 0.143. So we take that 0.143 and then add it to the 0.029. So we get 0.172. And then we move on to the next upper limit, which is 39.99. And then we're going to again add now 0.114 to 0.172 to give us 0.286. So what we've done now is we've put in our cumulative frequency for both. So we have our upper class limits and our cumulative frequency, and we end up with 1.001, which means we can go over at least 0.001 or under 0.999, which means that if you're getting it that close, that means you're adding your numbers correctly. Same thing over here for the retail stocks. We have our upper class limits, and then our cumulative relative frequency goes to 1.001. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and enter in our data into StatCrunch. So we have our, we're going to go ahead and put in our F upper class limits, and then we have our F cumulative relative frequency. So we put in our values, negative 19.99, and then negative 0.01, 19.99, 39.99. And then we're going to put in our cumulative frequency, so we have 0.000, 0.029, 0.172, 0.286, and we'll continue to enter those all in. So now the data for both the financial stocks of the upper class and the cumulative relative frequency are now in there, in addition to the retail stocks for the upper class limits and the retail cumulative relative frequency in that particular column. So we're going to go ahead and graph. So we're going to go ahead and select graph and select scatter plot, and then our x coordinate is going to be our upper limits. So we have F upper class limits, and then we're going to have our F cumulative relative frequency. We're going to make sure our points are highlighted and our lines are highlighted, and then we're going to select compute. So there is our ogive for our cumulative relative frequency. And then we're going to go ahead and select and graph the R upper class limits for the retail stocks and the R cumulative relative frequency with our points and lines highlighted. We'll select compute there. And we have our graph. And therefore, there's our ogive for that result. So the next question in part E wants to ask us which industry appears to have the better 3-year performance and then support your opinion. So you're going to use the correct displays of the data from the previous steps to compare the rates of the return for the two industries. You're going to compare the graphs and use this information to decide which industry appears to have the better 3-year performance.